Hello and welcome to Tech Deals. 4 graphics cards, 3 generations, and 6 games tested on the NVIDIA side of the GPU world. I will have a future follow-up video with the same 6 games tested with 3 generations over on the AMD side, but today it's all focused on Team Green. 1080p, high detail, going from 2015 to the newest models of cards. Starting off on the low end in today's test, we have the GTX 960 4GB graphics card. I've never actually shown the 4GB model on this channel in the past. It's always been the 2GB model. So this is the first time I'll be showing you a 4GB model because frankly 2GB is really not enough in 2020. Then we have the GTX 1060 6GB card. The 3GB card will work for some of these, and I'll call them out during the benchmarks, but in 2020, ideally, you've got the 6GB version. And then we have 2 current cards, the GTX 1660 Super, which is the revised version of the 1660, with 6GB of GDDR6 memory, much more memory bandwidth than the non-super version, which has GDDR5. And then at the top of today's stack, we have the RTX 2060, also with 6GB of GDDR6. We're not covering the Supers or the 2070s or 2080s because those will be looked at in a higher version of this, comparing to, say, the 970 and 1070 as opposed to the X60 cards. But today we're mostly looking at 1080p high detail on the $250-ish cards. Now I've got the actual footage from the benchmarks I'm going to show you here in just a second. They'll be in quadrants, so you'll be able to see all 4 at the same time with MSI Afterburner real-time performance numbers on the screen. I also have, in addition to the performance charts I'll show you in just a few minutes, I have dollar cost per frame per second on the current GPU prices, not launch prices, because, well, what difference does it make at this point in 2020? But at what these 2 cards are currently selling for used, and then the street price of these new. And then I also have percentage difference, and I have 3 different looks at the percentage difference on these cards. I have the increase from the 960 all the way through the RTX 2060, and then we drop it and we baseline it to 100% on the 1060 to see how much of a jump percentage-wise the 2 new cards is, and then we just look at these 2 separate. So I looked at it 3 different ways to provide you with some more information that hopefully helps you make a decision. Is it time to upgrade? Is it worth upgrading from one of these cards? Should you wait for the upcoming RTX 30 series? The current available information, subject to change, is that the RTX 30 series will launch, they'll announce it in September, and it will launch October of 2020. I am recording this at the beginning of April 2020, so if you can wait 6 months, a new generation of graphics cards will come out. We don't know their performance, we don't know their price, we really don't know a lot about them other than they'll be on the new 7nm production process and, of course, be faster. But how much faster and how much more, we don't know yet. If you are currently using a mid-range card like a GTX 1060 here, maybe you'll get away with it. Take a look at the benchmarks. We've got some brand new games I've never benchmarked before. If you're trying to use a GTX 960, well, you probably should have upgraded already, but I understand everybody's circumstances are different. We have 6 games today, including several that I have never ever shown you before on the channel, including Doom Eternal, Borderlands 3, Control, World of Tanks with the new ray tracing, although we don't have it turned on here because we don't have ray tracing, but it's the new Encore 2.0 benchmark with ray tracing. We have Ghost Recon Breakpoint, which is a fairly demanding game. And then finally, rounding it all up, we have F1 2019, which I've never shown you before. I've always used F1 2018, but I recently got 2019 as part of the Humble Bundle monthly choice package, which if you've never subscribed to it, you should because it's a great, great value. So those games are all coming up here in a second. Please stick around after the benchmarks for a few follow-up thoughts on these cards, as well as a little bit of history behind them and why this isn't included. This is a GTX 760. Yes, I do have one. No, I'm not including it this time around, and I'll include why after the benchmarks. But for now, why don't we get straight to those? Our first game today is also a brand new one, Borderlands 3. I have never shown this on the channel. The game's been out for a couple of months now, but I've now introduced it to my testing and benchmarking suite. You can see that we have a quad configuration on the screen. The upper left-hand corner is the GTX 960, the upper right-hand corner is the 1060, the bottom left-hand corner is the 1660 Super, and then last but certainly not least, the bottom right-hand corner is the RTX 2060. You can see the MSI Afterburner real-time numbers on the screen, but if you're watching this on a 5-inch smartphone, those are going to be really hard to read. You really need to see this on a computer monitor in order to read those numbers. Don't be afraid to pause the video at any point if you want to study the numbers, but there's enough benchmarks here you'll get to see several examples before we're finished. A couple of thoughts. 4 gigabytes of VRAM is not enough for 1080p high detail in Borderlands 3. In fact, it gave a VRAM warning, but I went ahead and ran it anyway because I wanted to keep all the testing the same. On a 4 gigabyte card, you're really going to want to turn textures down to medium. You can leave the rest at high detail, but textures will need to get turned down to medium if you don't want to run out of VRAM and run into some stuttering and frame pacing issues, which if you look at the frame pacing chart on the screen, you'll see a few of. Actually, even the 1060 has a few of them, although not nearly as many as the 960 does. Overall, this game runs pretty well on the 3 newest cards. It falls apart pretty badly on a 960, and speaking of high detail, you'd have to turn it down anyway, because take a look at our real-time performance. We're barely doing 30 frames per second. The other thing I want to mention is how much main system RAM we're using, which is nearly 13 gigs of RAM on a clean test bench. Yeah. Moving on to the benchmark numbers, 29 average on a 960, 48 average on a 1060, 66 on the 1660 Super, and 81 frames per second average on an RTX 2060. Similar percentages and similar performance jumps carry on with the 1% and 0.1% low. The GTX 1060, in terms of its relative value and low cost these days and how long that card has been out, represents an interesting value. But if you want to play new AAA games in 1080p high detail and get 60 frames per second, you're now starting to see the first wave of games that no longer do it. You'll have to turn those down to medium detail if you want to have any chance of getting to 60. And that's in terms of an average, not even the 1% low. Notice that the GTX 1660 Super does 66 frames per second. That is a fairly brand new card in a fairly brand new game. Do you want your graphics card to last for 3 years? You might need to buy more if this is the sort of game you want to play going forward. Control is another brand new game that I have never benchmarked before on the channel, and it does not have a built-in benchmark. So unlike Borderlands 3, you can't look at it frame by frame and see, oh, well, look, there's the performance difference, because it's going to vary as you run around and do stuff. Because it is also a new game, I've spent time playing it and gaining some abilities to get an idea of how to benchmark it and what areas best reflect the performance of this game. Having played with it enough at this point, I'm comfortable with the numbers I'm about to show you in the chart that they are reasonably reflective of what you can expect. It's not going to be the all-the-time experience, but in these type of games, certainly performance is going to vary depending upon what you do. But across the actual gameplay with the shooting and the throwing of objects and the defeating of enemies, I think these numbers fairly reflect the game's overall performance. This is a challenging one. It really is. I was surprised at how much horsepower it took to run a game that, to be completely blunt, doesn't look like it actually has that much going on. It's not like it's a massive open world with hundreds of enemies. So, well optimized, poorly optimized, the game's fault? You decide. On the GTX 960, we averaged 24 frames per second. Yes, that's atrocious and terrible. However, here's the funny thing. It was playable. It wasn't great, it wasn't smooth, and it wasn't something that I would want to do. But it was playable. If you really have a 960 and you really want to play Control, A, upgrade, and B, if upgrading is not an option, turning the details way down is absolutely going to be required in order to have a semi-reasonable experience. The GTX 1060 surprised me a bit here, 37 frames per second. Frankly, that is one of the most dreadful experiences I've seen on a 1060 at 1080p high detail in quite some time. you're really going to want to turn the details down even on that. I mean, it was playable, it was better than a 960, but not by much, to be completely honest with you. Now, the 1660 Super managed to average 54 frames per second on a brand new $230 card. Wow. Okay, maybe it's the game, because I would expect a new $200+ graphics card to do better than that at 1080p. Look at the 1% and 0.1% low, 42 and 24 respectively, so it kind of fell down there on the lower end of the spectrum. The $300 RTX 2060, 71 frames per second. We didn't even hold 60 on the 1% low on the $300 2060. The 2060 is a nice 1080p card and should be for a couple of years to come. But if we get too many more games like Control over the next few years, maybe not. Moving on to Doom Eternal. I recently published a benchmark video on this. If you saw it, thank you very much. If not, well, here are some more results for you. So this marks the second time that I have shown this on the channel. The GTX 1060 here has been re-benchmarked and re-recorded from the first one. The recording on the previous video actually had a problem, so I have gone back and retested this since, so you are not seeing the same benchmarks that you saw previously. You will also notice that the MSI Afterburner overlay is showing up on the upper left-hand corner on the GTX 960. Why in the world it's showing up there is beyond me, because Bethesda has overlays blocked in this game. Boo, Bethesda, you guys suck, because having those overlays lets me show the real-time performance numbers, which I cannot do on the newer cards. I wonder if it's a driver issue or maybe a compatibility issue with the older card that's causing it to show up, because nothing I did, and I tried, believe me, I tried to get the overlay to force show up on the newer cards, and it just would not. But it shows up on the older cards, interestingly enough. So, yeah, as you can watch the finishing moves and the gratuitous violence on the screen, yes, young eyes should look away, although I should have said that at the beginning. This is a very violent, very fast, very frantic action game with a lot going on. Very well optimized, however. Look at the performance. I mean, it's spectacular. It runs just fine. It runs a whole lot better on the newer cards, but frankly, it runs pretty well on the older ones. 49 frames per second average on a 5-year-old GTX 960. There's game optimization for you. Now, I could absolutely tell when I was playing on that card it was slower and less responsive than the newer cards. Given a choice, I would play on something newer. But if you have a 960 and cannot afford to upgrade, yes, you can play it. You might need to turn some of the details down to medium to achieve 60 frames per second. In fact, frankly, I would turn it to medium, because this is the kind of game where you want better responsiveness. 87 frames per second average with a 66 frame per second 1% low on the GTX 1060. 2 thumbs up for Bethesda. Well, okay, 1 thumb up for the game optimization and 1 thumb down for the lack of overlays, because it makes my job harder, but hey, not bad. And as you saw from the footage, if you watch my original video on this, I did re-record it. I got a much better recording this time. That was a video capture error on my part, because it certainly didn't do that in live gameplay either this time or the first time. Moving on to the new cards, this is where the split in performance is going to happen with new optimized games, and I think this is the distinction that a lot of people miss. Look at the monster performance difference between a 1060 and a 1660 Super. That is not reflective of their raw horsepower. That's reflective of the fact that this game more effectively utilizes newer cards that have drivers optimized for them. Now, some of this may very well be NVIDIA's day one optimized drivers at work. Some of this may just be the newer features on the newer card. But a jump from 87 frames per second average to 147 frames per second is not just the raw horsepower. That's a driver/card thing. 181 frames per second on the 2060. Believe it or not, we're actually being held back a little bit by the CPU there because we're at 1080p. If we were playing at ultra detail, if we were playing at 1440p, there'd be a larger difference, I think, between the two. But yeah, that 1660 Super just walloped the 1060. Another brand new game, F1 2019. Now, I've previously shown F1 2017 and F1 2018 on the channel multiple times, but thanks to Humble Bundle, we now finally have F1 2019 in our library, and yeah, it kind of performs about the same as F1 2018 did. I wasn't expecting it to be different because it's basically the same engine and the same game with basically new rosters and drivers and whatnot, but yeah, it performs great. In fact, take a look at the real-time performance numbers in the upper left-hand corner on the GTX 960. We're over 60 frames per second at 1080p high detail. For a 5-year-old card, that's not bad. However, it is definitely doing something different on the 960 because take a look at the main system RAM usage. Now remember, this is the exact same clean test bench with nothing else running in the background. On the 1060, 1660 Super, and 2060, we're using just under 8 gigabytes of main system RAM and about 3.5 gigabytes of VRAM. Or are we? On the 960, we're using almost 12 gigabytes of main system RAM and the same 3.6, 3.5 gigabytes of VRAM. Why? That is an excellent question that I don't have an answer to because this is repeatable. And there's nothing different about the test bench other than changing the graphics card. And if you look at the numbers on the screen, you'd say, well, it doesn't need more VRAM. I would agree. I don't think it does need more VRAM. But on the 960, it is definitely using a lot more main system RAM. 67 frames per second average on the 960, 116 frames per second average on the 1060, a whopping 195 frames per second on the 1660 Super, and wait a minute, hold the horses, what's going on here? 185 frames per second on the RTX 2060? Wait a minute, the RTX 2060 is faster in all respects. It has the same amount of VRAM, and it's a faster card with more compute units. So how is it slower? Now, after looking at these results and putting this video together, I stopped what I was doing, I went back upstairs to my test bench, I put the RTX 2060 back on the test bench 3 days after recording this, and I did it again. Because I'm not going to publish a result like this without testing it. After re-benchmarking, I took the 2060 off, I put the 1660 Super back on, refreshed the drivers, and tested it again. This result was repeatable 3 days later after re-swapping the cards. No, I don't know why, but it was repeatable after going back and forth between the cards and rerunning and rechecking all of the various settings, 1080p high, making sure that all of the main video settings were exactly the same because, yeah, why would an RTX 2060 be slower? Any ideas? That's what the comment section is for, but I am absolutely sure that this is a repeatable result. Ghost Recon Breakpoint, a game I have shown many times on this channel. I enjoy playing this game, but this time we have the built-in benchmark, partly for time reasons, and partly when doing a comparison like this, there are advantages to running a built-in benchmark that allows you to do frame-by-frame, side-by-side comparisons to see exactly what is going on. In this game, the GTX 1060 will absolutely run at 60 plus frames per second in the game, I can tell you from experience, without a problem. It's very playable so long as you have sufficient CPU power. Big open world games like this really do like a lot of CPU power. I would rather have a 1060 6GB card and an 8-core 16-thread chip playing at 1080p high detail than a 4-core 8-thread chip and an RTX 2080 Ti. And the reason for that is frame pacing and frame smoothness. Take a look in the upper left-hand corner on the GTX 960. Now, it is not holding 60 frames per second. But if you look at the very, very small frame time graph up there, it is smooth. The frame time graph is not jumping all over the place. We're not using a lot of our CPU because we're obviously heavy GPU bound, but it's a fairly smooth experience because we've got a fast, high-clocked, modern multi-core processor that just sort of looks at this game and goes, yeah, sure, okay, I got this, no problem. A 4-core 8-thread chip will run the built-in benchmark just fine, but I will tell you from experience, it's much, much choppier when you're actually in the open world playing the game. So this game is as dependent on your CPU as it is your GPU. No, I don't want to play this on a GTX 960, and yes, it is VRAM limited. If you look at the others, you'll see we're at about 4.5 gigabytes of VRAM on the GTX 960. It's using a swap to the main system RAM. You'll see it's using more main system RAM there as it swaps, and it even gave a warning. I showed the beginning, just before I clicked Start Benchmarks, you could see the red line and show that it was actually being blocked because it didn't have enough VRAM, but it actually still runs pretty well, all things considered. You can exceed the VRAM requirements of a game a little bit without having dire consequences. Every game's going to be different, but at some point you'll exceed it by too much, and then the performance goes right into the toilet. But for the moment, it's making do pretty well. Having said that, the new cards obviously are going to do better, and if you can afford them, then certainly not only will they do better in this game, but they'll do better in the games you play in the coming months and years ahead. 47 frames per second average on the 960, which is frankly better than I thought it would do, to be completely honest with you. The 4 gigs of VRAM helped tremendously there. 80 frames per second average with a 65 1% low on the 1066 gig card. I've heard a ton of people say, oh man, Ghost Recon Breakpoint, that game is horribly optimized. It is an unoptimized pile of Ubisoft garbage. Why in the world would anyone play it? Really? The GTX 1060 is 4 years old. It was a $249 graphics card in 2016. And it's playing Ghost Recon Breakpoint at 1080p high detail over 60 frames per second 99% of the time. What's your definition of unoptimized garbage if it's doing that? Because I really hate to see it. I mean, okay, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, sure. And from live gameplay, I can tell you it's fine. It's not a problem. Now, the 1660 Super does 104 frames per second with 83 1% low, which just makes it a nicer experience. And notice that it tapers off a bit with an RTX 2060. The RTX 2060 is faster than the 1660 Super, but not tremendously so. Part of what you're paying for is Tensor cores and ray tracing cores, which don't matter here, but might matter more in the future. It depends. Moving on to World of Tanks, the Encore benchmark. This is the new ray tracing version, although ray tracing is not turned on, not even on the RTX 2060, because then it really wouldn't be very comparable. Frankly, the amount of ray tracing in World of Tanks is pretty minor, all things considered. It's not as impressive as, say, some of the other ray tracing games are. It's a free-to-play game, and it's got to pretty much run on anything. Take a look at the real-time performance in the upper left-hand corner on the GTX 960. Yeah, we're over 60 frames per second. I'm not going to show you the whole benchmark because otherwise we'd be here for 3 minutes, and it doesn't take 3 minutes of this to make the point. Now, if 60 frames per second is not sufficient and you'd like over 100 frames per second, then sure, a GTX 1060 will certainly do that. 144 frames per second on a 144 hertz monitor, well then a GTX 1660 Super will sure fit the bill, unless you want at least that frame rate 99% of the time, in which case you might be surprised. 69 frames per second average on the 5-year-old GTX 960, 117 frames per second on the 4-year-old GTX 1060. There is a legit honest performance difference between those two cards, and really the 10 series was an incredible value back in 2016. If you bought one then, good for you, and if you skipped it, well, that's okay too, but it is pretty amazing. Now, if you want the faster frame rates, notice that even an RTX 2060 does not maintain 144 frames per second 99% of the time. It's at 120, 1% low. But still, that's pretty good, and it'll be 144 like probably 97 or 96% of the time, which is good enough for most people. As always, spend more, get more. Now, all the other tests were at 1080p high detail. Quick note, this was at Ultra because the World of Tanks Encore benchmark doesn't give high as an option. It's medium or Ultra, so this was run at Ultra. Another way to look at the performance is a dollar cost per frame per second chart. I have taken the current prices of these cards, the new prices of the 1660 and the RTX 2060, and the current eBay used prices in the United States of the 960 and 1060, and I've divided them into the average frame rate across all 6 games that I've just shown you. And these are the results. On average, the GTX 960 cost $1.26 per frame per second. The 1060 is $1.73 per frame per second. The 1660 Super is $1.93, and the RTX 2060 is $2.20. Now, just going off this chart, you might say, wow, look at that. For $60, a GTX 960 is the best deal going. Yeah, technically it is, but that doesn't mean it's playable. The thing is, choose the least expensive card that provides the frame rate that you want, unless you also want the ray tracing features and tensor cores of RTX, or you want a little bit of future-proofing. I would like to call your attention to the fact that the GTX 1660 Super for $230 is really not that much more expensive than a GTX 1660 for $140. Now, yes, in real terms, it is $90 more expensive, but because it is demonstrably faster with newer technology and GDDR6 and better future driver support, I think it's worth the money. If you're looking at buying between those two cards and you have the money, the 1660 Super is the lowest end card that I would actually buy new today. I wouldn't buy anything less than that. If you can afford it, the RTX 2060 is a little bit of a premium, but again, you are getting DirectX 12 Ultimate capabilities. If you are, in fact, on a really tight budget, then finding either a GTX 1660 or an RX 580, which is basically the same thing in terms of performance, is certainly an acceptable option, but you are giving up performance and you're giving up the ability to play games going into the future that the higher-end cards would certainly handle. These next three charts cover percentage difference. This first one is all four cards with the GTX 960 as a 100% baseline, 6-game average percentage improvement. The GTX 1060 is 69% faster than a 960. The 1660 Super is 148% faster, and the RTX 2060 is 185% faster. Notice that the gain drops as we go up, because part of that premium for the RTX is, of course, ray tracing and tensor and not raw performance. The 1660 Super is, in my opinion, the best long-term value, while the 1060 is the best current value. Speaking of the 1060, taking the 960 off and baselining performance to the 1060, the 1660 Super is 47% faster, and the 2060 is 69% faster. Again, that big jump comes with the new card, the 1660 Super, less of a jump at the 2060. Moving the baseline up to the 1660 Super, you see the RTX 2060 on average was 15% faster. The price is 30% higher. So half of the price difference, $70, half of which is $35 of the price difference is going to performance, and $35 is going to RTX features. So here's the question. Would you be willing to pay $265 to get the performance of the RTX 2060? And would you be willing to pay another $35 to get the benefits of DirectX 12 Ultimate feature compatibility, the tensor cores, and ray tracing? For some of you, the answer is yes. For some of you, the answer is no. But in reality, the raw performance difference takes out half of the $70 price difference. You're only paying a $35 actual price difference to get the RTX features on top of the boosted performance for the card. If you have the money, buy an RTX 2060. 3 years from now, you'll be glad that you did. Thank you all so much for watching all of those benchmarks. 2 gold stars to all of you who watched through this entire video. It's greatly appreciated. Quick background note here. The GTX 960, the initial launch version with 2 gigabytes of VRAM, launched in January of 2015 for $199. $200 basically. The GTX 1060 6GB card launched in the summer of 2016, just 18 months after the 960, for $249. Now, to be sure, it was $50 more expensive, but to be honest, that was totally worth it. The performance improvement of a 1060 over a 960 plus the additional VRAM is absolutely worth the extra $50 between these cards. And the fact that there was only 18 months between them, the 10 series really was a good value, and if you bought them at launch, even to this day, you can absolutely still play everything on this. Control does fall apart a little bit. It's not ideal, but Ghost Recon Breakpoint runs fine, and like 99% of games still play fine at 1080p high detail at 60 frames per second on a 6GB 1060. They won't for much longer, but you've gotten a really good run since this card is nearly 4 years old. We'll get to the new cards in just a second. I mentioned before that I'm not including the GTX 760 anymore. Interestingly enough, I didn't know this until recently. I just wasn't paying attention at the time. This was available in a 4GB version. This is a 2GB card here. It's a EVGA card, nice twin fan cooler, works great. This was available in a limited edition in a 4GB version. However, that card does not have the performance or the horsepower to take advantage of 4GB. It is even slower than the 960, and at this point, if you still have a 760, I'm willing to guess that the reason you haven't upgraded is, respectfully, you don't have the money. If you don't have the money, what difference does it make how much faster the newer cards are if you can't afford to buy any of them? Now, it's true you could possibly find a used 1060 at this point that maybe fits within your budget, but frankly, you could have done that a year or two ago and gotten a very similar price. These haven't really dropped in price in a while, and of course they spiked during the cryptocurrency craze. So yeah, if you're playing League of Legends, CSGO, Dota 2, and that sort of thing, yeah, I guess a 760 is fine. But we're making this video in 2020, and the idea is, can you play newer games that I haven't previously tested, that are more demanding, and if they're struggling on a 960, we're going to take this and we're going to put that into the archive category. Interestingly enough, the 760 launched in 2013, about not quite 2 years before the 960 for $249. So it was actually more expensive, and the 960 launched at a cheaper price. Nobody seems to have acknowledged that at the time, I suppose, but it is what it is. Moving on to the new cards. Now, let's skip ahead to the top-end card. The RTX 2060 launched first. It launched in January of 2019, or 1 year and 4 months before making this video. It launched for $349. That is a $100 price premium over the 1060. Now, in fairness, it does add Tensor cores, ray tracing, and improved NVENC encoder for live streaming to Twitch or making your own videos or whatnot. It does have some nice new features that the 10 series lacks. And of course, being a new architecture and a new design, it's going to last you longer in the future from this point. Not necessarily from when it launched, although it will, than a 10 series will, not just because of the performance, but because DirectX 12 Ultimate, which is what the focus is going to be with the new consoles, PlayStation 5 and Xbox One, Xbox Series X, going forward, because AI cores, otherwise known as Tensor cores on NVIDIA side, plus ray tracing, hardware ray tracing cores, is the future. And DirectX 12 Ultimate is a new superset of DirectX 12, and you have to have those features in order to support it. So the RTX will support that. The GTX 1660 Super won't. Same improvement, same improved NVENC encoder, GDDR6 on the Super model, which is why you don't want to buy a non-Super at this point unless it's just way cheaper. The memory bandwidth improvement is tremendous on GDDR6. It really makes a big, big difference to memory bandwidth, which as textures get larger and games get larger will just increase the gap with the non-Super version of that card. Now, interestingly enough, the 1660 Super is supposed to cost about $220. As of April 2020, as I filmed this, good luck finding one for that price. It's doable occasionally, but you'll find a lot of these in the $240 price range. You will also now find a lot of the RTX 2060s in the $299 price range. When I'm filming this, there's only about a $40 price difference between these two cards. Now, I fully acknowledge that the RTX 2060 is not miles and miles ahead of the 1660 Super. But $240 versus $300. Now, we're talking US prices here. If you live somewhere else and the prices are different, adjust as needed. But in US pricing, I'm not convinced that the 1660 Super makes a lot of sense at those prices. Now, there have been sales and deals. Just a couple of weeks ago from filming this video, there was a deal on Newegg for the 1660 Super for $199. At that price point, my opinion completely changes and it becomes an amazing value, and you should snap that up at $200 all day long. At $240, when the 2060 is $299, yeah, I'm just not impressed. Get the RTX. You want the DirectX 12 Ultimate future-proofing. You want the faster performance. You don't know if you'll need it. You don't know when you'll upgrade. But at that kind of price difference, when you're already over $200-ish, I think it makes sense for the extra $40 or $50 or $60, depending on what the price is at any given point when you are shopping for cards. Now, I mentioned before that we're not talking about the 2060 Super and 2070 and all those. Those are higher end cards at higher, $400, $500 plus $100. If you are in that price bracket, you aren't looking at any of this way. And if you've got a $500 budget for a video card, you're not, I hope, not running a 5-year-old video card like a GTX 960 anyway. So as far as how much faster is an RTX 2070 over a 960, huge, massive, amazing, incredible, spectacular. Yes, if you have $500, go get one. It's incredible. It'll blow it away. But I'm not sure how many people are actually going to make that upgrade. It's a big upgrade, let me put it that way. So the short and sweet version of all of this is if you can find a good deal on one closer to 100 than 150, a GTX 1060 6GB is still worth buying used in 2020 if you're playing games that work well on it. If you want to play Control, maybe not. If you want to play some upcoming games and have a card that's going to last you a few years, it's going to start struggling. But if you don't care to play every new game that comes out and you are on a tight budget, then especially in the $120, $125 price range, I really like the 1060 6GB card. Wouldn't get a 3GB at this point. I would have 2 years ago, but that ship has sailed. And then as between these two I already mentioned, price-wise at $240 and $300, then the RTX makes total sense. Interestingly enough, on the dollar cost per frame per second chart, the 1660 Super is the better deal. But there's more to deals than just that one. It's a data point. It's a single piece of information. Considering the DirectX 12 Ultimate support, considering you don't know how important the AI cores and the RT cores are going to be 2 years from now. If you're buying a card for the next 3 years, I think for $40 to $60 difference, I think you spend a little bit more, you get the RTX, and it just takes the stress off of having to worry about it. That's my opinion. It's your money. You do whatever works for you. Like this video if you like it. Share it with your friends if you love it. Remember to subscribe to the channel with the big, huge red button directly below. Questions, comments, thoughts, feedback, suggestions, you know where the comment section is. Links in the video description for all of this. I will link to these cards on eBay. If you are on a super duper budget and you just want something that plays World of Tanks, then by all means, you can pick up a GTX 960 in the $50 to $60 price range, rock on. I don't think it makes a lot of sense when this exists, but I understand that, if you don't have any video card at all at the moment, then that is totally awesome. And I will, of course, link to Amazon and Newegg and eBay for the new cards as well. Please be sure you're subscribed, and please be sure you hit that bell notification icon, because when the AMD version of this comes out, you'll get a notification. And for those of you who are Team Red fans, I will do all of this all over again for AMD. Thank you all so much for watching. I will see all of you next time.